There are houses that are built to impress. And then there are houses built to prove that a family has conquered the world. Lynnewood Hall was one of those houses. Hidden behind trees in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, just outside Philadelphia, stands one of the most extraordinary private mansions ever built in America. A 110-room palace of limestone, marble, art, ambition, and silence. People have called it America's last Versailles. But behind its grand columns and endless halls is not only a story of wealth, it is a story of tragedy, a story of a family that had everything until one night in April 1912 changed everything forever. This is Lynnewood Hall, the mansion the Titanic left behind. At the end of the 19th century, America was changing fast. Railroads, streetcars, steel, banking, real estate, and industry were creating fortunes so large that the old rules of society seemed to collapse. A new American aristocracy was rising. They did not have royal titles, but they had money, they had power, and they built houses that looked like palaces. One of these men was Peter A.B. Widener. He was born in Philadelphia in 1834, and he rose from modest beginnings to become one of the richest men in the United States. His fortune came from streetcars, transportation, investments, and business deals that helped shape the modern city. But Widener did not only want money, he wanted legacy, he wanted beauty, he wanted a home large enough to hold his family, his guests, his art collection, and his place in American history. So he commissioned a mansion unlike anything around it. The architect was Horace Trumbauer, one of the great architects of America's Gilded Age. Trumbauer would become known for designing grand estates, institutions, and private homes for some of the wealthiest families in the country. But Lynnewood Hall would become one of his masterpieces. Construction began in the late 1890s. When it was completed, the house was almost impossible to ignore. It had 110 rooms, vast reception halls, long corridors, a private art gallery, bedrooms, servants' quarters, libraries, salons, staircases, gardens, and spaces designed not only for living but for displaying power. This was not simply a home, it was a world, a private kingdom built in stone. And inside that kingdom, Peter Widener assembled one of the most important private art collections in America. Paintings by European masters, rare objects, rooms designed to hold beauty like a museum. In many ways, Lynnewood Hall was not just a family residence. It was a temple to wealth, culture, and permanence. But permanence is an illusion. No matter how strong the walls are, no matter how expensive the marble is, no matter how carefully a dynasty is planned, one disaster can change the meaning of everything. In 1912, Peter Widener's eldest son, George Dunton Widener, traveled to Europe with his wife Eleanor and their son, Harry Elkins Widener. Harry was young, educated, and passionate about rare books. George was the heir, the man expected to carry the family empire forward. They returned to America aboard the most famous ship in the world, the RMS Titanic. On April 14, 1912, the Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. By the early morning hours of April 15th, the ship was gone. More than 1,500 people died. Among them were George Dunton Widener and his son Harry. Eleanor survived, but she returned without her husband and without her son. And Lynnewood Hall, the mansion built for family, legacy, and the future, was suddenly marked by loss. Imagine the halls after the news arrived. A house built for generations, now echoing with absence, a dining room without the heir, a library without the young collector, a family fortune without the people who were meant to inherit its meaning. Peter A.B. Widener was already an old man when the tragedy happened. He had built Lynnewood Hall as a monument to success, but after the Titanic it must have felt different, less like a palace, more like a memorial. 3 years later, in 1915, Peter Widener died. The house passed to his surviving son, Joseph E. Widener. Joseph kept the estate alive for many years. He was also a collector, a sportsman, and a man of wealth and influence. Under him, Lynnewood Hall remained an important private residence. But the world around the mansion was changing. The Gilded Age was fading. Servants became harder to maintain. Taxes rose. Family fortunes became complicated. The great American estates that once seemed untouchable began to look impossible to sustain. After Joseph Widener's death in 1943, Lynnewood Hall entered a new chapter. The art collection that once filled its rooms was no longer the same. Some of the greatest works connected to the Widener family would eventually become part of public collections, including the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. The mansion remained, but the world it had been built for was disappearing. Over the decades, the estate changed hands. The land around it was reduced. The enormous private kingdom became smaller, and Lynnewood Hall began to lose the life that had once filled it. For years, it was used by religious and educational institutions, but eventually the mansion became vacant. And then came the silence. A house with 110 rooms does not become empty quietly. First the voices leave, then the furniture, then the heat, then the maintenance, then the protection. Rain finds a weakness, dust gathers, paint cracks, plaster falls, vandals enter, photographers come looking for decay. And slowly the palace becomes a ruin. Lynnewood Hall became famous again, but not for the reason Peter Widener intended. It became famous as one of America's largest abandoned mansions, a ghost of the Gilded Age. A place where people could still see the bones of unimaginable wealth, but also the damage left by time. The grand staircase was still there. The columns still stood. The proportions were still magnificent, but the house looked wounded, as if history had not ended but had been left unfinished. That is what makes Lynnewood Hall so powerful. It is not just beautiful, it is tragic, because every room seems to ask the same question. What is the point of building a palace for the future, if the future never arrives? The Titanic did not sink Lynnewood Hall, but it changed the story of the family that built it. It took the heir, it took the grandson. It turned a mansion of ambition into a mansion of memory. And for decades, the house stood as if waiting for someone to decide whether it would be saved or lost forever. In recent years, that question has started to change. Lynnewood Hall has been connected to preservation efforts, with plans to restore and protect the mansion after years of neglect. For people who love historic architecture, this matters, because houses like Lynnewood Hall are rare, they are not easy to build, they are not easy to maintain, and once they are gone, they cannot truly be replaced. A restored Lynnewood Hall would not only save a building, it would save a chapter of American history, the story of the Gilded Age, the story of the Widener family, the story of American ambition, and the story of how even the richest families could not escape loss. Today, Lynnewood Hall still stands, not as perfect as it once was, not as empty as it once seemed, but as a survivor. A mansion that has seen fortune, art, power, tragedy, abandonment, and the possibility of rebirth. Maybe that is why people are still drawn to it, because Lynnewood Hall is not only a house, it is a warning. A palace can be built in stone, a fortune can fill its rooms, a family can plan for generations, but time, tragedy, and fate can walk through the front door anyway. And sometimes what remains is not the wealth, not the parties, not the paintings, but the silence of a house that remembers everything. This was Lynnewood Hall, America's last Versailles, the mansion the Titanic left behind.